Associate Professor Antoinette Powell has been at Lawrence University's Seeley G. Mudd Library since 2002. She earned her undergraduate degree in music education with an emphasis in piano performance at St. Norbert College and her Master's of Library Science at the University of Pittsburgh. She also did graduate work in music history and literature at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Since living in Appleton, she has documented the history of people and events in Appleton's Old Third Ward, where she lives with her husband, Keith. She is webmaster for the Old Third Ward Neighborhood Association, where she serves on the board of directors. In addition, she is co-president of the Friends of Hearthstone, Inc., which surprisingly is in the Third Ward. In 2015, Antoinette was named the recipient of the Outagamie County Historical Society's annual Lillian F. McCasey Historian of the Year Award, which honors outstanding contributions to Outagamie County history. The History Museum at the Castle and African Heritage, Inc. created a civic engagement initiative to highlight the marginalized history of Black experiences and racial discrimination in Appleton, Wisconsin, called A Stone of Hope, Black Experiences in the Fox Cities. Antoinette contributed research on the Cleggetts, Hollinsworth, and Newman families for this pop-up exhibit and hopes to turn that research into an article-length publication. She also gave a presentation on those families at the History Museum in 2014. Please welcome Antoinette for her presentation, Seeking a New Life, African American Pioneers in Appleton.
So the first thing is, why would somebody leave a familiar place and go someplace completely unfamiliar? Well, the first one I thought of was adventure. Think about California and the Alaska Gold Rush. I'm leaving the East, I'm going out West, I'm going to make my fortune. And that kind of ties into economic conditions too. You want to make a little bit of money. What if you retire and you decide, I'm going to sell my house and buy a motor home and I'm going to travel all over the country? That's going someplace really unknown. Or if you decide you have the means and opportunity to just pick up and leave, I think it might be fun to live in that state or in that city rather than where I am now. The second one is safety. So the place you're living has a natural disaster. You can't live there anymore because it's not safe. Or there's a war going on, or there's ethnic or racial conflict that affects you personally, or some kind of persecution, like religious persecution. Economic conditions, you're just getting into the workplace and you find that the place you live has no job for you, or you lose your job that you've had for a long time and you find there is no other job for you there, so you do have to move. And then finally, the forced location. And the two examples, I think the two most extreme examples there would be the removal of indigenous people from their ancestral lands and also Africans who were taken in the slave trade. So who are we talking about? We are talking about William Sylvester Cleggett. And according to this federal population census record, which is taken in Appleton, where they were at this time, he was born around 1833 in Pennsylvania. Now, if you've ever looked at census records, you know that one record does not the truth make necessarily. You have to look at many records. But in this case, we're going to go with what it says on this record. And ideally, I'd like to find his birth record to make sure that that's where he was born and when he was born. But unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, before 1906, none of the vital records needed to be recorded. That was taken care of at the city level, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, a county level, or in churches. But I don't know where in Pennsylvania he was born. So I have to go to another record. And in this case, we are very fortunate to have William Sylvester Cleggett's own handwriting saying where and when he was born. This comes from his Civil War pension application. And if you know anybody who was, in the Civil War, and you can get a hold of that person's pension application, they give their life story in addition to detailing where they were in the Civil War. So I'm going to go with what he says. He was born in Columbia, Pennsylvania on the 13th day of November in 1833. So Columbia, Pennsylvania is in Lancaster County in the state of Pennsylvania. South central-ish, east-ish part of the state. And you can see that on this map, which is from 1851, you've got the United States, and then you've got that no man's land, the Northwest Territory. Wisconsin is a state by this time, as you can see. But then if you get farther west from that, you're really in unknown territory as far as the United States is concerned. So I don't know if you can see this. Yeah, you can see it pretty well. This is the 1940 census from Marietta, Pennsylvania, which is also in Lancaster County. And it's just a hop, skip, and a jump from Columbia. And here we see a William Cleggett, who is not our William Cleggett. This is his father, who is also named William Cleggett. He bought property in Marietta, Pennsylvania in 1839. There's a record of it. And his family in this record is listed as free colored persons. So in 1840 and in 1839, his father, William Cleggett, was a free colored person. And I want to read something about the people in Columbia, Pennsylvania. I'm going to go to the next one, which is the census record from 1850. Now they're in Columbia, and they have a blended family. How do I know it's a blended family? Well, the father says he's 30 years old, which is wrong. He's 40 years old. He was born in 1810. His wife is 28, but look, he's got a 19-year-old, a 17-year-old, two 15-year-olds. So this is his wife, but not the mother of those children. Plus, they were born in Pennsylvania. They were born in Maryland. Two of them are 15 years old. One of them born in Maryland, one of them born in Pennsylvania. And I have to digress a second and tell you about an entry. I'm a music person. So there's a dictionary of, biographical dictionary of musicians. And it says, the Bulgarian composer Pancho Vilanjanek was born in Switzerland, but his twin brother, Ludin, had emerged on the previous day in Bulgaria. It seems their mother was distrustful of Bulgarian obstetricians, and after giving birth to the first twin, decided to take the train to Switzerland to bear the second hours later in improved medical circumstances. So this is from Baker's Biographical Dictionary of Musicians, written by Nicholas Slonimsky. If you ever get a chance to read anything by Nicholas Slonimsky, whether you like music or not, do it. So this is a map of Columbia, Pennsylvania from 1850, and you can see that William Cleggett, the father, has his business on 3rd Street between Cherry and Union Street. Not only that, but his wife, Margaret, also has a business on 3rd Street between Cherry and Union Street. And I had to look up that word gaffering because I had no clue what her business was, but it must be dressmaking because that's making pleats or ruffles in fabric. So both William and his wife, and if you looked at that 1950 census record, 2 of their sons were also barbers. So they all had their business in Columbia in 1850. And I want to read something from a historian called Carl Oblinger from the Lancaster County Historical Society Journal. And he says, the 20 Negro barbers of Lancaster City and Columbia Borough who clipped the hair and shaved the beards of the white community in 1850 shared common economic and social backgrounds. They were all members of 6 well-to-do Negro families, which had been present in the county for at least 30 years. So that's going back to 1820, and which had accumulated property over the same length of time. Now, he also says all of these people were literate, which tells you they were pretty far removed from slavery in 1820 when they came there. And he specifically mentions William Cleggett, the father, as one of several, quote, able and intelligent businessmen. So they've got a good business going there in Columbia, the father and the sons. So let's take another quick look at Columbia. So there it is, very, very close to the border with Maryland, which is called the Mason-Dixon line. And we always think of the Mason-Dixon line as being associated with the Civil War. But according to this historical plaque, that line was formed 100 years before that, just as a border between those two states. And in 1850, the year we're talking about now, it was the border between a free state and a slave state. It was also a transportation hub. You've got railroads, you've got roads, which they called turnpikes back then. You've got that lovely Susquehanna River that goes all the way from Maryland up to New York State. And also, Columbia was the demographic center of Lancaster County's antebellum urban black community. A quarter of the population of Columbia was African American at this time. You also had William Whipper and Stephen Smith in Columbia, Pennsylvania. These two were considered to be 2 of the wealthiest African Americans in the country before the Civil War. They were lumbermen, they invested in real estate, they invested in banks and the stock market, in coal, they owned railroad cars. And so they were pretty well-off people. Remember William Whipper's name, because he's going to come back a little bit later. William Cleggett's, our guy, William Cleggett's wife, Rebecca Hollinsworth's brother, follow me, married William Whipper's sister. So he was a chattel-in-law of William Whipper. Also, the Quakers lived in Columbia. The Quakers, as you know, founded Pennsylvania, pacifists, and at this time, also abolitionists. So we're going to wrap up these 4 things. You've got a big African American population. You've got sympathetic white population who are pacifists and abolitionists. You've got 2 really rich guys who own all this stuff. And then you've got a transportation hub. So put that all together, plus the fact that it's just feet from the Maryland border, and you've got a prime location for the Underground Railroad. In fact, the term Underground Railroad, most historians think, started in Columbia, Pennsylvania. It used to be called Wright's Ferry, and Mr. Wright in the early 19th century was already helping people who escaped slavery move north. I'm going to go back to William Cleggett's Civil War pension application. And of course, you can't read this, but he's talking about his father, William Cleggett, and Fred Douglass were on adjoining farms in Tuckahoe. Tuckahoe is on the eastern shore of Maryland, and that is where Frederick Douglass was born, Frederick Bailey, in 1818. So he's saying here, my father was enslaved with Frederick Douglass. Then he goes back even farther. My grandfather was on a tobacco plantation near Hagerstown, Maryland. And then this quote, they bring young boys together, brought for the way out of bondage, and followed the North Star and made the way for freedom. Now this kind of sounds like William Cleggett and Frederick Douglass were on the Underground Railroad and they were taking people across the border. Well, that's not what he's saying, and that isn't what happened. But it's possible that William Cleggett was part of the Underground Railroad. I'm going back to Mr. Oblinger again, and he says that William Cleggett became politically active. Quote, "Black barbers also acted in concert with white abolitionists to fight the Columbia colonization societies." So his father was becoming politically active in Columbia. And there's Frederick Douglass. So, should they stay? Should he stay in Columbia? In 1856, William Cleggett married Rebecca Hollinsworth. They had an infant daughter who was also born that year. And they were also caring for Rebecca's niece, whose mother died, and her father, the young girl's father, took the 3 children and put them in homes with other relatives because he could not care for them. So in Columbia, there was a big supportive black community, a quarter of the population. You've got the white population, the abolitionists, who are in sympathy with them. He had a skill. He was a professional guy. He was a barber. And he had an established business along with his father. And living in Columbia, they could get practically anywhere they wanted. They could take a train to New York. They could take a train to Pittsburgh. They could take a train to Philadelphia. So it was a convenient place to live. Why would they want to go? Well, mid-19th century, a lot of people were coming into that area of the country looking for jobs. And there was competition for jobs, not just between the white people and the black people, but everybody was competing for jobs. There was the tension because of the colonization society. And the colonization society said, we're going to take African-American people and send them back to their homeland voluntarily. We're not going to make them go, but we're going to give them money so they can go. And not everybody in the black population was okay with this. And that third point was a good example of that, where he was fighting the colonization society and he was organizing people. And this might have been a little bit too dangerous for William Jr. so to stick around. Then there's the Negro entry book, which is a fascinating part of history of this area of the country. In Columbia and in Lancaster City, every person of color had to register with the mayor. And they got a card that they carried around with them saying that they registered with the mayor. And this included men, women, and children who had to carry this card around with them. And this is an entry, and I know you can't read this, from the Negro entry book from Lancaster City. And it says, Negro, William Rockaway, aged about 30, born in New Jersey in Middlesex County, manumitted by his master Isaac Amby, of dark complexion, stout build, resides John Pinkerton in this city. What a genealogical gold mine this is. So at the time, it wasn't such a nice thing that these people had to submit to, but here, descendants of William Rockaway not only know where he was born, they know who owned him in New Jersey, and they could put him in Lancaster City in 1823. So this was kind of an indignity that the Cleggetts would not have to worry about if they did not live here. Then finally, the Fugitive Slave Act. And I don't know if anybody watched the little bit on Frederick Douglass on PBS last night, but so they talked about the Fugitive Slave Act there. This is a federal act passed in 1850, which made it a federal offense to interfere with the capture of any person who escaped slavery in the South. Not only could you not interfere with it, but if you did not cooperate with the capture of someone who escaped, you could be charged with a federal crime. Also, bounty hunters could pick up any person of color and say that they were slaves and then sell them. So free people of color were in jeopardy of being enslaved. And as William Whipper said in a letter to William Still, from 1850, when this act went into effect, to 1855, Columbia lost almost half of its African American population. And he says by immigration to Canada, but it could also be by immigration elsewhere, just north or west, but just out of there. So they wouldn't have to be worried about this Fugitive Slave Act. So where are they going to go? Let's go back to Columbia. There it is. Now, Rebecca Hollinsworth's family, William's wife, lived up in New York State. There's the Susquehanna. That's how they get there. They lived in Owego, New York, right across the border. So they could have gone there. That's where his in-laws lived. Or he could have gone to Canada around Chatham. There was a colony there that was founded specifically for fugitive slaves, and it was called the Dawn Colony. And his sister, William's sister, Sarah, lived there. And also James Burns Hollinsworth and Marianne Whipper lived there, and they kind of took care of everything on that end of the Underground Railroad for William Whipper. So we know they didn't go to New York. They didn't go to Canada. They went west. And this is from a newspaper in New Orleans from 1856, the same year that they left, just detailing how many people are coming into those western lands, the state of Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, but also farther west. 2,000 people every day coming in from the east. The state of Wisconsin was also asking people to come to the state, but not the whole state. They didn't want any more people in the cities. They wanted people to populate those central and northern portions. They had uncultivated land. You could get a cleared farm. But William Cleggett was not a farm guy. He was a city guy. He wanted a city. He had a business. He had a profession. He was not interested in uncultivated land or cleared farmland. So where did he go? Not Appleton. He went to Stevens Point. Why in the world? They landed in Stevens Point on August 11th, 1856, with his wife, his infant daughter, and his wife's little niece. So what kind of African American population did he find in Stevens Point in 1856? Let's find out. Before we go there, I forgot about this. I'm going to take you a little portion of this map from 1851, and you will see the Fox River Valley, and you will see the three villages of Lawsburg, Appleton, and Martin. There was a period of time about that long, I'm making very short fingers, when that westernmost portion of Appleton was called Martin, and that was Theodore Conkey's idea. He wanted to name it after Morgan L. Martin, but Morgan L. Martin didn't want to have any of it. He said, no, I don't want that little village named after me. So it became Grand Chute. And this cartographer captured that very brief moment in time where that little village was called Martin and not Grand Chute. And it's misspelled, yep. So let's see what the African American population in Stevens Point looked like. This is from the 1855 Wisconsin State Census. So we've got Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Tark, you've got John Woodley, and you've got Lloyd Thomas Bryan. That's it. That's the African American population of Stevens Point. So what did these people do for a living? Andrew Tark was a barber. Let's see about John Woodley. He was a barber. Any guesses for Lloyd Thomas Bryan? Yes. So all three African American men who lived in the town of Stevens Point were barbers. And it seems that Lloyd Thomas Bryan left town, came back to town. So this ad says, here he is, he's back in town again. And then in December of 1857, William Cleggett put an ad in the Wisconsin Pinery saying, hey, I'm here too. And one of the reasons might be Lloyd Thomas Bryan was William Cleggett's half-brother. So that might have been a little bit of a draw to come to Stevens Point. So here is William Cleggett. He's got a saloon, or salon as they called it, over E. Foot's hardware store in Stevens Point in 1856. Sadly, in 1861, in August, Foot's hardware store burned down, and he did not have a business anymore. So now what's he going to do? He joined the 8th Wisconsin Light Artillery, and he went to Camp Utley in Racine County. Now, this is not the United States Colored Troops that formed later. He was joining an all-white outfit as a mess cook for the officers. And he says he was answering the call of the president that happened earlier that year in April of 1861 for 75,000 volunteers. I am a good and loyal citizen of the United States. So Abraham Lincoln was asking 75,000 men to join for 3 months because he thought 3 months, that'll do it. That's all it'll take. So he joined up. And he said, I left a family of 4, which is a wife and 3 daughters by this time, behind in the dead of winter to take my place in Uncle Sam's army. And I love this part. I did not carry a musket, but did carry cooking utensils and braved all the perils as the rest of my comrades. So he was serving, and he says elsewhere in his Civil War application to save his brothers from slavery. So that's why he joined. Well, he was discharged in 1862 and went back to Stevens Point and spent a couple of months there. But then in 1862, May 16th specifically, he arrived in Appleton. And what was the African American population of Appleton in 1862? Well, this is the census from 1860. And you have 3 households of African Americans: a widow, a fiddler, and a barber, Norman Anderson. Well, William Cleggett set up shop on College Avenue, and this is an ad from the Appleton Crescent from July 12th, 1862. So within the course of his time in Appleton, he was an entrepreneur. He was not only a barber, he was in the ice trade, and he provided people with oysters and coffee, and he opened an eating house in the Central Northwestern Railroad depot. And he delivered strawberries, and he also did a commencement dinner for Lawrence University. So think about it. He started doing all this stuff very shortly after he arrived in Appleton. So he had to determine, was there a call for these kinds of businesses? He had to secure a venue for the businesses he had. He had to tap into the supply chain, to use the current vernacular. He had to find places that would supply him with stuff to sell, and he had to hire people to do this. So this is in addition to being a barber and a shaver, if you want to call it that. So what about the women in the family? Well, Rebecca Cleggett had her own business on College Avenue. At first, when she went into business, she took orders from her husband's shop, but later she had her own shops that moved to different locations on College Avenue. The daughters, the 3 daughters, all went to Lawrence University. So there's Sarah Emma Cleggett, and here is Mary Amelia Cleggett. And then the 3rd daughter, Ada, also went to Lawrence University. Mary Amelia Cleggett was the first African American graduate of Lawrence University. and that was in 1876. She went to Arkansas to teach after she graduated, where she met her husband, who was a member of the Wampanoag tribe from Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. They married in Arkansas and moved back to Massachusetts, where she became an historian for the tribe. And in 2018, Lawrence University named a loft in one of the dorms the Mary Cleggett Vanderhoop Loft. And here's a picture of her taken from a series of newspaper articles she wrote for the New Bedford Evening Standard about the history and traditions of the Wampanoag tribe. Here's the 1880 census, and Rebecca and William have it right. They're out working, they've got their own businesses, and the two daughters are home keeping house. At this time, Mary is in Arkansas, so it's only Sarah, Emma, and Ada. Sarah Emma was known as Emma, and when she married her cousin Albert Hollinsworth, she was from then on known as Mrs. Hollinsworth. She had her own business, so this is the third business in the family, all in hairdressing and hair goods. Her husband left her after their two daughters, Rebecca and Louisa, were born, so she had to make her own living. She was also the matron at the children's home on Story and 5th Street for a while. And she died in 1906, and Ada, her sister, took over her business. That's Miss Cleggett, that's Ada Cleggett. And Mrs. Hollinsworth's business was memorialized in a red quilt around 1900. She was a very popular and very well-loved woman in town. So what about her daughters, Louise and Rebecca? Well, Edna Ferber went to high school with both of them. And in her autobiography, A Peculiar Treasure, she talks specifically about Rebecca as being her buddy, because they both loved Charles Dickens. If anybody is not familiar with A Peculiar Treasure, get a copy of it, because it outlines her early life in Appleton, and she writes in great detail about people and places and describing homes and who lived where. It's just the greatest book.
What was the name of it again?
A Peculiar Treasure.
And the author was?
Edna Ferber. Edna Ferber. So if Rebecca was her pal, Louise, the other daughter, was her rival, because they were both in declamatory contests, which was a big deal at Ryan High School at the time. This is at the turn of the century. So Edna was the winner for the state contest, and Louise Hollinsworth came in second place for the Ryan declamatory contest. And here's a picture of Gertrude Louise Hollinsworth from the First Congregational United Church of Christ. So she was known as Louise. And here she is in production at Ryan High School in 1905. And you might recognize some more names there in the cast. She would die only a few months after this, at the age of 18, in 1906. Her mother died after her in 1906, and then her sister Rebecca unfortunately died in 1909. So the three family members all died within a span of 3 years. So let's go back to William. He had a business by himself. He had a business with his brother George, who lived in Appleton for a short time. He had a business with Mr. Lehman on College Avenue. Unfortunately, it did not last forever, but nothing lasts forever. And then he was in business with a Mr. Williams, 2 doors down from the German drugstore. And that German drugstore was called Benway's Drugstore, and it was in the Masonic block, which caught fire in 1874. And when you talk about a block at this time, it's not what we think of as a block, which is from this street to this street, but rather a building that holds several businesses. And you've seen this, I'm sure you've all seen this picture before. This is the Masonic block. And when it burned in 1874, there was an extensive newspaper article about it, of course, because it was a big deal. And in that newspaper article, they detailed which businesses were in this building. So that German's Oddfellows Hall was in that little third-story portion, and then you've got Benway's drugstore, and then second floor is the dentist, and then next to Benway's was the bookstore, and over that was the real estate office. What about Cleggetts barber shop? It was saved. It was not burned, even though it was part of that building, which is terrific. So that building, you can see it on this 1876 map, the corner of Oneida and College, where the Zucchi building is now. Around about the mid-1880s, Mr. Cleggett expanded again. So he went to Kaukauna. He opened a restaurant. He also was helping his nephew, Charles Newman, who was ill at the time, helped out with him. He was a barber too. And then he also leased the Gogebic Hotel, which is near Ironwood and Hurley. So he moves to Ironwood, Hurley area with his brother George. And it's pretty apparent that he went by himself. He did not take his family, because newspaper articles around this time say Mr. Cleggett went back to Appleton to visit. So they decided, the Barbers decided they were not going to open on Sunday. Everybody agreed to it. But things happen, and then sometimes you have to keep your barbershop open on Sunday, even though you agreed not to. He went into business with Thomas Braxton, and then he was not in business with Thomas Braxton anymore. And then Thomas Braxton was robbed. This is a fascinating story, because William Cleggett was the lookout for the robbery. He only got $10 out of the $158 that was stolen. The other two men were arrested. William turned state's evidence, and the charges were dropped against him. This is quite a thing. So why would you rob somebody who was your partner in business? You were already associated with him. But they did. So that was not a very good year for William Cleggett. However, in 1899, things looked up for not only him, but his brother, George. Their uncle died and left each one of them $175,000. Now, in case you're wondering, that's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. And this was not liquid. This was investments, property, stocks, and so on, which was talked about in a different article. So they were waiting around for this estate to be settled, but there was no evidence that this ever happened. At least I couldn't find any. So a few years later, William Cleggett's back in Appleton, and he's arrested again, this time for practicing without a license. It says here he is taking in very little money a week. This is not the action of somebody who just inherited $6 million. So this is another reason we know that the state was never settled and they never got the money. But look about 20 years earlier, and you can see he and Rebecca were doing pretty darn well in Appleton. The day after he was arrested for practicing without a license, the fine was remitted. He said, I'm going to get a license. They said, fine. So justice moved very, very quickly back then, at least in this case, in 1904. Going back to his pension application, he started this process in 1907, and it lasted until 1913. There was a continuous stream of letters begging them to give him a pension. He enlisted the help of Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. He had affidavits from people who served with him in the service. He detailed every place his unit went. He said who the people, who the officers were. But none of that mattered because he was never officially mustered in. So he kept getting letters back saying, your name's not on the list, your name's not on the list. And he continued to write and write and write, thinking if he made his case, he would get his pension, but it never happened. I don't want to beg, but if I'm worthy and merit any help, ... I've been a taxpayer. And then he says something very strange. I've been a member of the GOP since I voted for Abraham Lincoln. Okay, little background. So Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860 and 1864. And African American men did not have the right to vote in 1860 and 1864. So one of two things happened. Either the person at the polling place did not know he was an African American man, or he knew and he looked the other way. So when did the African American men get the right to vote? It was in 1866. What else was happening in 1866 for the Cleggett family? Well, they were doing pretty darn well. This is 4 years after they hit town, and he's got the shaving, the shampooing, the hairdressing, the oysters, the restaurant. He's got all this stuff going on. Also in 1866, who comes to town to talk but Fred Douglass? And we don't know if the Cleggetts were in the audience that day. I'm hoping they were, and I'm hoping they got to speak with him and talk about his father and Frederick Douglass. Also, William's sister, Sarah, became a widow. She and her husband, the Reverend William P. Newman, were living in Cincinnati. He died of cholera, and his congregation thought enough of him that they collected money to send his widow and her 4 stepchildren and her son to Appleton, and they built a house for them on the northeast corner of 6th and Cherry Streets. Cherry is now Memorial. Another thing happened in 1866. There was a mayoral election. And by golly, William Cleggett got 4 votes for mayor in the 1866 election. So not only could he vote, but he's on the ballot. So I think Appleton was pretty good to the family in general. He died in 1816, and the entire family, those of whom stayed in Appleton, are buried in Riverside Cemetery. And I want to point out this website. It's burialsearch.com. If you have any interest in who's there, where they are in Riverside Cemetery, this is a tremendous website, and it'll tell you who's buried where. Burialsearch.com. So it's the ultimate irony that the Cleggett family, and William Cleggett in particular, is resting directly across the road from the monument to the Grand Army of the Republic, which you can see in the background. So he was denied a pension, he served in the Civil War, and now he can see that monument from where he's resting. Thank you.